There are many obstacles that can block the path to a successful software project. When you come across one, it helps to think like a seasoned hiker and follow the trail marked by blue blazes around the problem so that you can get back on course and keep moving forward. Welcome to Blue Blazes Podcast. I'm your host for the journey, Jay Tower, and I'm a partner and principal consultant at Trailhead Technology Partners. In this series, we talk with industry experts who share their best tips for avoiding the pitfalls on the path to successful software projects. My guest on this episode of Blue Blazes is Sarah Dutkiewicz, or Saduki as she's known online. Sarah's a senior trainer at Nimble Pros and a well-rounded tech leader with an impressive resume. She's a published author, conference organizer, and speaker. Her expertise spans architecture, domain-driven design, DevOps, database, and web development, as well as user experience. She brings these varied perspectives to technical and non-technical teams, helping them bridge communication gaps to find understanding and grow. In this episode, Sarah and I dive into the world of event storming, what it is, why it's a game changer for building shared understanding across teams, and how it can help you deliver better software solutions. I'm excited to share the conversation with you. Hey, Sarah, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Jay, thanks for having me.
Yeah, really great to have you. We just got to see each other at an event in person, so it's kind of fun to see you 2 weeks back to back.
This is awesome.
But we didn't get a lot of chance to talk because you were busy running the event. But I'm excited to talk to you about this topic, which we're talking about event storming today. Can you give the elevator pitch? What's event storming to someone who's never heard of it?
So event storming, we see this mostly in the domain-driven design world. And think of it as we're not getting into coding, we're getting into conversations. There's a lot of sticky notes involved. So basically you get people together in a room, and there's different reasons you would do event storming. So you could do it to understand like a domain or understand a business or understand a product, for example.
Mm-hmm.
You could do it to understand a process. You could do it to understand a system or maybe the whole architecture for whatever you're working on for a project. You can use it to understand legacy code. So what do you have? And maybe you want to modernize it. And so how do you go from what you have to there? So event storming was founded by a gentleman named Alberto Brandolini. And the quote that he does is merge the people, split the software. So merge the people, bring everybody together in the room, build up a shared understanding, learn the words that other people are using, and figure out like what are the right words. So build what we call a ubiquitous language or a shared language essentially. And then he says, merge the people, split the software. Split the software means that after you have all these conversations, you may be able to now split the software into small pieces. You may be able to split software into modules. You may be able to split software into microservices. You may be able to identify where splits need to be so that things become more manageable. Because typically when you're having these conversations, it's around big topics, big concepts.
Jay here. Just a quick break in the conversation to share how Trailhead can help you tackle your toughest business challenges. When you're navigating uncharted technology terrain, Trailhead creates custom software solutions that put you back on the path to success. Ready for the next step? Get started with an expert consultation at trailheadtechnology.com/offer. That's trailheadtechnology.com/offer. Now back to the conversation.
But it starts with, so the event part of event storming, it starts with an orange sticky note.
Okay.
Kind of like, I don't have one on my desk right now, but the orange sticky note's the key thing. And the reason why is because this is where you're understanding the question I always ask with events are what happened. They're written in past tense, and it's usually something like, well, if I'm doing e-commerce, submitted order or payment processed payment, something like that, but it's written in past.
Mm-hmm.
And the events are so you understand what happened, and then you can like lay it out and understand things in terms of, well, do you need to understand it in terms of time? Or do you need to understand it in terms of groupings? So the demos that I usually do for event storming are around e-commerce, because e-commerce has been where I've been in my field for a long time. And so I use it to talk about, okay, what does a buying process look like, for example? from searching for the item I need all the way to, okay, now I've received the item. Sometimes I also have to talk about not so happy path, like it got lost, or it's stuck in a snowstorm in Cincinnati and it won't be here for a few more days. Things like that as well. So that's like looking at the process and the timeline that way. But I could also be like, well, I need to structure my e-commerce app in a way where I have different modules that talk to each other. So I have like the customer stuff here. I have the order stuff here. Well, sometimes these apps and systems that we map out and talk about are too big. And so we need to have the event storming session to understand what are the parts that are there.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good elevator pitch. So you mentioned DDD, or domain driven design, as being kind of where the world that this comes from. The thing about DDD is it's kind of almost like a whole religion, right? All the pieces that fit together. It's pretty big. So a lot of people are familiar with maybe parts and pieces of it, but don't feel like they implement all of it. Is this the sort of thing that you have to do with all of DDD, or can it be standalone?
So I'm probably going to go against the grain on this until you can do a standalone, and you don't have to necessarily do DDD. We can steal the practice from them. But the thing is understanding like how it works. And the process for event storming, I mentioned the orange sticky note because that is how it starts. There are other colors, other representations as well. So like understanding the process, understanding systems that are within the process. So understanding things for our e-commerce. So like an inventory management system or a tax processing system, things like that. Those get represented by pink sticky notes. Who uses the system? So are we talking about a user? Are we talking about an admin? Those different roles, those are little yellow sticky notes. And there are other colors as well. So we get into things like commands, which usually are what triggers the events. And those are written in a imperative, like do this thing. There are read models, so giving context as to what do you need to know in order for this event to happen. Those are light green sticky notes. There's all sorts of other colors in there as well, but those are the main ones. Then there's one that we call the hotspots, or I call them pain points. And they represent them different ways. Now, when I'm doing event storming, you've seen me do these at conferences. So you see me using actual paper and sticky notes on the walls. But I also deal with this digitally. So using a tool like Miro, Miro.com, they have digital sticky notes. And sticky notes with pain points, you want to capture like where are questions and where are things that are going wrong. And so usually I use like a black sticky note because it's black sticky note, white text. It really stands out. It's the elephant in the room we have to address. The other thing I might do is like a comment bubble with a funky font. So again, it stands out, but we capture those pain points. The key with event storming is it's not necessarily about the code and how you're building it. That is a thing, that is a conversation you can have. That is a particular event storming, but it's about having those conversations and figuring out where to go.
So DDD talks about there being a strategic design and then a tactical design based on what you just said. I would assume that this fits then into the strategic design layer. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah. So you're typically like the strategic, you've got that planning side of things. Tactical, you're okay, now let's look at it a little more in depth. This is still a high level. You can use this to go into lower level, but you don't have to.
So I'm guessing that a lot of people who are maybe just listening now and just hearing about event storming for the first time have already jumped in their heads to something that they're already familiar with that's similar, like UML or ERP. How does event storming contrast with those? Like, why would you want to learn more about event storming and use that over UML or ERP?
So when you mention UML, you probably see the cringes. For those on the audio side, won't see the cringes, but I promise you that I cringe at UML because there's so much formality, there's so much technicality. And with event storming, you're typically bringing in the technical and the non-technical. So if you're doing what they call big picture event storming, or they're doing it for discovery of a domain or discovery of a product or of a situation, you typically have the experts who are business people. So they understand, how does the business run? It's not about your code. It's about solving a problem that the business has. In big picture event storming, you have people who are there to filter out the technical and actually explain, well, this is what we expect from the business side. These are the steps we want. These are the goals we need to meet, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
When we get into process modeling, again, it's having those conversations of how does this process work and identifying. You have people who are going through the process. You have people who build the process and who can impact the process, but they're not guaranteed to be technical. Again, event storming, sticky notes, and working together. It's in a familiar environment that you don't have to know the formalities of, okay, this arrow needs to point which way, this box needs to go where.
Right.
You don't have that. I mean, the
Yeah.
closest you get to that is if we use event storming for system design, or what I like to call event storming for refactoring, where now, okay, we have to look at the code. We have to look at what we have. We have to look at where we're headed code-wise. And then, okay, now what is that structure? That gets a little more formal, but again, it's not nearly as formal as the UML or other mapping things. And it's good because it makes us have those conversations and focus on the conversations and focus on the business needs and not get lost in curly braces and semicolons.
Right. So what I hear you saying is UML is so technical and exacting that it really shuts down conversations, especially with maybe non-technical stakeholders that you want to be in the room and involved.
Between non-technical stakeholders and even some of the technical stakeholders who don't have the UML training. Like, for example, when I first came into the field, we didn't cover UML in our courses. And so when I came out here, I'm like, what in the world is this? There's a lot of formalities. When you learn the formalities, it's not bad. But if you're someone who was never formally introduced to it, it can be a bit to take in.
Yeah. Well, and developers even in a room with 10 other people, and you start drawing UML diagrams together, it's going to feel an awful lot like you're doing documentation, right? You're going to lose them.
Now, documentation doesn't have to be that bad, but yeah. And what I like about event storming is if you capture the pictures, or if you do it digitally, you do have, I'm going to use the term documentation loosely, but you do have the documentation of capturing that context and capturing those conversations.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned there's different types of event storming or purposes for it.
Yes.
Can you talk through some of those?
So there are the three ones that you'll see in the books by Alberto Brandolini and by Paul Rayner. Paul Rayner is here in the U.S. and runs a conference called Explore DDD, and he also does talks on event storming. The big three are big picture event storming, or used for discovery, process modeling event storming for understanding processes and pain points and being able to identify like key stakeholders, for example. And then the last one they do is the system design. And so they both have books on event storming that are out there. They're both works in progress, and both of them have that blind spot of system design isn't well documented in either book. I recommend their books because they give a good picture of event storming, even though it's unfinished. System design, though, think of it as you know where you're headed. You have enough domain knowledge. You have enough process modeling. You have enough understanding in general. You got to figure out, how do I build the code?
Okay. So, so the big picture one, this is more focused on like, what do we have and what are all the pieces that fit together? Is that right?
Yeah. That's discovery. And the key takeaways there are trying to build that shared understanding.
Okay. And then process, you're starting to get a little more specific, maybe into specific parts of your processes. I saw a talk with you talking about this recently, where you also mentioned one that you kind of invented that you called refactoring. Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, because this is one of those, as I look at the books that they did, I was just like, well, yeah, system design is good when we have to have that conversation. It's usually, so event storming for system design is typically done with developers and software architects because it gets into the technical discussions. But not all of us have the luxury of being able to deal with greenfield systems. In fact, I think a lot of us are in brownfield and legacy systems. And so now we're like, what do? I need to modernize. Sometimes you're brought in as a outsider and you need to help them modernize, but you have no idea where to start. So this is where you can use event storming to understand, what do we have? So yes, there's things like what happened, but also what do we have? And how is it laid out? And talking through that with sticky notes. And then going, okay, we have, for example, you think, oh, I've got a CRUD app. Okay, well, what are you doing with your CRUD app? Well, we're working with these different objects. Okay, is it really just CRUD? No. What else do we have going on? More sticky notes come up there because we're having that conversation. Oh, maybe this is an actual case where I do need to go from a CRUD app to something a little more serious with domain-driven design in mind. How do we break this up into our different bounded contexts and then go from there? So for when I call it for refactoring, it's doing system design. So it's still going to be developers and architects, but we already have code that we're working with. And now we need to understand it better and understand what do we have and where do we want to go with it. And especially when I think about the stuff I deal with for the clients that I work with, it's usually doing something like going from ASP.NET web forms. So we're talking pretty old to something modern.
Okay. So who all is in the room for event storming, and what are the different roles that everybody takes?
There are the three main characters, I call them. I use the term loosely. The main one is the facilitator, and that's the person to make sure that everything is moving along just fine. Because sessions are typically going to be time boxed based on what the business allows for. So the facilitator is going to be the one who usually starts the conversation and puts that first sticky note to get people thinking. The facilitator will ask questions to keep things going, and then the facilitator will also have some way of keeping time. Sometimes some places have a separate timekeeper, but for the stuff I do, I usually am the timekeeper and the facilitator. Then the other two groups are, you have the people who have the questions and the people who have the answers. So the ones who have the answers, sometimes you hear them called domain experts. But I'm going to tell you, there have been conversations I've had with clients where the domain expert is somebody who just started yesterday who happened to figure out how this thing worked because it wasn't documented. So I'm going to use that term expert loosely. But it's the people who have answers to questions and the people who have questions who go, I need to know more about blah. For example, you're dropping me into a client where I've never heard of how to work with an ERP system, for example. I'll forget that I have no careers in ERP systems as well. But let's say I got dropped into that. I'm like, what is this? What's a router? What's 3 of 9? What are barcodes? How does this even work? Like having those conversations. So I would be the new kid with all the questions. The people there would be like, oh yeah, routers, what tracks the parts from station to station. And this is what it goes through. Oh, and let's talk about the process. The facilitator in that conversation could be like, hold up. We only have about an hour or so. This process is going to take longer. Let's save this for maybe another event storming session or another conversation.
Okay. So would it be fair to say that in your typical event storming, that the question askers, that's going to be your systems analysts or your software developers or something, and the question answerers, those are going to be what maybe traditionally you might have heard called stakeholders, or business domain experts or something?
Or the domain experts, or the people who have been doing this for long enough that they have an idea as to what's going on.
Right. Okay. And then you mentioned that there's sticky notes of different colors. So
yes.
How do those break down? What types of sticky notes are there, and what do each one represent?
So when it comes to all the event stormings, the orange sticky note is key, and that's the event. It's the what happened. It's the how do you actually go from here? Like what happened in the system, or what happened at this particular part in the legacy code, things like that. But then from there, again, the next color that I go to is light pink. And light pink are systems. Now, systems they could be internal to your company, but external to the system you're working on now. With my e-commerce example, I like doing process modeling because that's what people can relate to. But then the systems I pull in there are things like, well, there's an address verifier. So making sure that the address on the order is correct. There's a shipping calculator. There's a tax system. And the story I tell about that is we had an issue on our website. I was working on the e-commerce side where the site wasn't calculating the tax correctly. The ERP team was like, it looks fine on our end. And we had a conversation, and an IT admin on the other side of the cubicle wall was like, oh yeah, by the way, there's a tax system as well. The ERP system uses the tax system to calculate the taxes, and that was what was going wrong. ERP team learns that there's a tax system involved. We learned it. So now I make sure that there's a pink sticky note to represent the tax system. I also have on that kind of layout, and I'll send you the diagram if you want to put that in as well for the video side of it. But there's a little yellow sticky note that I attach. Sometimes I attach it to the system. Sometimes I attach it to the events. And it's just to identify either who could trigger it or who's responsible for it. In the tax system case, I put a yellow sticky note to say who's responsible for it, because now we know the admin who is in charge of that system. The other thing, so those are the three key ones that you'll see, for example, in big picture process modeling. The last one is the a sticky note for capturing what we call pain points or like open unknown questions that we're not sure how to answer. And for those, I try to use a color that is totally absurd and doesn't match any of the other sticky notes we use. So if I'm going online, then I'm going to use that black sticky note with white text because that is very different. I might also use chat bubbles with a wild font because, again, very different stands out. We want to make sure we capture unknowns. We want to make sure, because another takeaway that you'll see with big picture process modeling or how do we answer those unknowns. When we get into systems and refactoring, the other things we have are read models. Read models are going to be a light green, and it's what is the information we need to know. There are aggregates, which is common in domain-driven design. And so these are, think of it as kind of like you have these boundaries and you have these other objects that you need to kind of group. So what I deal with in the e-commerce is the cart, the order, and the customer. And so those are yellow sticky notes. Let's see, blue sticky notes are commands. So those are done in an imperative, like do this. It's typically what triggers an event. I think I got all of them. I'm looking at, so I have a picture I use that actually talks about what we call the event storming grammar. So given this information, which is the light green, for this user, little yellow sticky note, not the regular yellow sticky note, but little yellow. And then the blue is the command. The pink is there a system that happens to be involved. Then there's the event. And you can have multiple events running at the same time. Concurrency is a thing. You can have a command trigger multiple events. Oh, purple. I don't talk about purple or lilac much, but that's policies. So whenever or under certain conditions, you capture those as policies.
Okay. So a lot of different colors. It sounds like it would be helpful for somebody who's doing this for the first time to maybe have somebody like you in the room who's experienced as the facilitator to make sure that they're remembering all these pieces. Is that your experience?
So typically I'll have the conversation with people ahead of time to understand the event storming situation we're going in. And then I'll talk with them about the colors as we need them. So I don't even introduce all the colors at once. I start with orange. Then I go, okay, now let's introduce the next set, which is usually the user and the systems. Okay, then let's talk about the context. So I introduce them at the time that we need them. So because if you show the full grammar, which I do in my talks, I do show the full grammar first, but it's too overwhelming in an actual event storming situation. So
yeah, you get through two of them and you're like, okay, I'm following, and then the third one and fourth one and fifth one, you start to blank out a little, right?
Too many colors. What does this one represent? Am I getting this right? Did I just use the wrong color? Well, I get all sorts of questions, and I'm just like, take a deep breath. If you use the wrong color, we have more sticky notes. We'll make it work. So it's not about, honestly, I have to remind them, it's really not about the colors. The colors help us when we look at it, but it's about the conversations. It's about the takeaways from it.
Right. It's not about the rules as much as it is about what you learn from it.
Yep.
So somebody who wants to get started with event storming as a way to document processes and systems, so how do you recommend that they get started?
I start out by recommending eventstorming.com. So that's the site that Alberto Brandolini put together that covers everything you need to know about event storming. He's got a book called Introducing Event Storming, and Paul Rayner has a book called The Event Storming Handbook. If you're one of those people who works well with books, those I recommend. Now, if you're somebody who works better with videos, then I'm going to recommend, so Alberto Brandolini spoke at Explore DDD in 2017, and did a talk on 50,000 stickies later. And then in 2019 at ORDEV, he did a talk on 100,000 stickies later. Those videos are also things I would recommend. Now, this is where I do event storming wrong. I haven't been counting the sticky notes. So.
Yeah, it sounds like that's like a bragging rights thing. You have to compare your sticky note count. Okay, good to know. Great. So eventstorming.com is a good place.
Yes.
Brandolini is a good person to search for on YouTube, it sounds like.
Oh, absolutely.
And then if somebody wants to find your content that you've produced about it, they can search your nickname, Saduki, and probably find all kinds of good stuff.
Yeah, you can find it between Saduki.com and the Nimble Pros blog. You'll find quite a bit on event storming.
Okay. Well, we've been talking about event storming as a way to help make software projects more predictably successful.
Mhm.
But what other topics or what other guests do you think would be beneficial for our listeners to hear about?
So I'm going to go with the topics that developers like to avoid, which is documentation and getting
Yeah, we just
not
joked
just
about that.
documentation in general, but
Uh-huh.
getting it so that it is done nicely and done so that it's easy to follow. So earlier last year, I wrote a book called Communication Patterns by Jackie Reed. And just reading through it, you learn about things like don't put boxes within boxes within boxes. And she does a really good job of talking about the different patterns that we see in our visualizations and in our architectural diagrams, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, Jackie, so she's got the communicationpatternsbook.com as her site. And I will gladly send you her email address. She would definitely be interested in chatting with you more.
Yeah, that sounds like a great suggestion. Well, Sarah, thank you for the time helping us understand event storming a little bit better and the other resources that you have suggested. Really appreciate your expertise and your time today.
Well, thank you for having me. This has been fun.
Yeah, definitely. That's the end of this Blue Blazes podcast. If you're interested in hearing more conversations like this one with industry experts focused on how to make software projects more predictably successful, make sure to subscribe. Trailhead can be found online at trailheadtechnology.com, on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Until next time, thanks for listening.